Hello, Brubs. We're back with Funeral Customs and Their Origin and Development by Bertrand S. Puckle. And we are moving on to chapter 6. Let's see how long it is. 100. Oh, that's what, 30 pages? Probably have to read this in halves. Just because. Alright, let's get on with the butter churning bullshit. So, what are we going to stop at? Page 115? Wherever the break is. This is too high. Chapter 6 Funeral Feasts and Processions. We have seen that certain parts of the body have been eaten, in the belief that by this means such special virtues as the dead may possess would be transferred to those who thus participated, and we must bear this ceremonious cannibalism in mind in considering the funeral feast proper, for there was originally a connection. We must also remember the important fact that food has been offered from the earliest times at the grave for the sustenance of the dead in their spiritual state. Superficially, it would strike us as incomprehensible that even the most untutored mind could have supposed that the food so thoughtfully provided was actually consumed by the departed shade, in view of the fact that it still remained to molder on the grave. This is a misconception of a point of view. Wallace Budge mentions that in many places in the Sudan today, mind you, this is 1926, meat and drink are still brought to and laid on the graves, and the dead may partake of them at their pleasure. But he reminds us that the ceremonies performed by their priests are believed to change the material substance of the offerings into a spiritual form, and of this the dead partake, leaving the material elements to be consumed by the priest and the relations, by which means they are brought into communication with their dead. It is probable that the earliest funeral feasts were nothing more than a distribution of the food offered to the dead, after they had obtained, as it was supposed, supernatural nourishment from it. Some echo of this may be traced in the Bulgarian custom of feasting in the cemeteries on Palm Sunday, when the remains of the good things provided are left on the graves for the dead. The most ancient Egyptian ceremonies were connected with offerings to the dead, wine, sweet, beer, cakes of various kinds, fruit, scented oils, the heads of bulls, and a variety of ceremonial garments were used for the purpose. So too by the Romans, whilst today the Chinese and the older civilizations hold fast in one form or another to the belief that the spirit needs some form of nourishment. Once again, in this practice, we shall find the old terror of being haunted by the ghost asserting itself. The Bodo of India carry the dead man's share of food and drink to the grave, saying, "Take and eat. Heretofore you have eaten and drunk with us. You can do so no more. You were one of us. You can be so no longer. We come no more to you. Come you not to us." After this recital, in order to make the changed position still more definite, each mourner throws on the grave a thread bracelet, which he breaks off his wrist, saying, "Take that, the tie between the dead and the living is snapped." A similar ceremony is performed at the funeral feast in the Solomon Islands, where a portion of food is thrown into the fire, and the dead are thus invoked. This is for you, and even at the daily meal a certain portion is set apart for their use. Pagan usage, sanctified by Christian interpretation, has frequently been carried forward to our times, and it is interesting to note that when the Trappist monk is taken by death from the community, his meals are still served for him in the refectory, for 30 days after his decease, being given afterwards to the poor. To the superstitious mind, a food offering should properly be served at the burial place. Otherwise, a danger would be incurred by inducing the soul to wander back to its former haunts, a thing above all which mankind has sought to avoid by many a childish subterfuge. In countries where the sacrifice of animals formed part of the religious rites, it frequently took place where the dead were buried in order that they might have their part in the consumption of the meat thus provided. Where the belief exists, as in China, that the dead have a duality of souls, one of which remains in the grave in order to receive the offerings of the living, the importance of the food supply is seen, for it is imagined that the soul would starve if not regularly, why do I suck at that word? Regularly regularly nourished, in which case, of course, it would not fail to make its appreciation of the fact unpleasantly patent to the careless relatives. In ancient Egypt, the regular portion of each man's estate was set apart for the use of the dead. For the purpose of feeding the dead, a tube or channel was sometimes used, connected with the mouth of the corpse, through which food was passed. Such practices throw some light on ancestor worship and the severe test of enduring affection it imposed on those who had not only to reverence their parents during their life, but also after their decease, the latter being considered as a higher virtue and the supreme test of filial affection as being the more difficult of accomplishment. In this country, at least, as late as the days of the Stuarts, it was a common practice for the mourners to drink wine from a cup placed for the purpose on the coffin, and in so doing to enter into a kind of communion with the dead. In the obsequies of all time, some form of feasting stands out prominently as an important and necessary part of the ceremonies. What do you got, Brav? Yeah, I'm reading the Bible, you motherfucker. There are always so many excuses to be found for celebrating any special occasion by eating and drinking that we may easily overlook the fundamental idea in accepting the practice as an ordinary form of hospitality. At first sight, it does not seem unreasonable to account for the provision of a repast, for the mourners are being a natural courtesy shown to friends and relations gathered together in order to take a last farewell of the departed. Knowing as we do that in days gone by, traveling was not only a very difficult, but often a costly and even dangerous undertaking, it would appear rational enough that a substantial meal should be provided for the necessities of the guests. Before the introduction of such conveniences as post or telegraph, several days might well elapse before those relations living at a distance could be advised of the death, and several more days would be taken in traveling to the house of mourning, so that relations might have to be entertained for some considerable time before the family could be assembled, and the burial take place. Much of it may have been contributed to the continuation of the usage. Hospitality was certainly not the origin of the funeral feast. The special object of the gathering was largely for the purpose of offering prayers for the soul in the actual presence of the body till the burial. Even if we credit the early Christians with enlightened motives in adopting Jewish and pagan customs such as shrouding the corpse with scented oils and spices, which much annoyed the pagan mind, it is significant to note that in the 4th century, the charge was leveled at them that ye appease the dead with wine and meals, which even now hardly cease to be true. Whilst the wake or watching was closely associated with special prayers for the dead, it had a further significance. We know in our own time how frequently the question of the manner in which the dead may have disposed of their possessions becomes a matter of excited interest, and we know also how old feuds which have smoldered for a generation or longer may be fanned into flame by the unexpected turn of events, and especially so when by a sudden illness or as the result of an accident the natural order of the older generation dying off before the younger is rudely broken. In such cases, priority of claim or complicated legal issues suddenly appear in a new light, strengthening hopes of inheritance, which had but a few hours previously seemed but very remote, or destroying anticipations which, humanly speaking, had been held for long years to be certainties. If such is the case in these more or less moral and law-abiding times, when the factor of foul play is practically eliminated, we must realize that in the past, when family quarrels were considered as honorably settled by deeds of violence, when the sacredness of human life was not allowed to stand too often in the way of illegitimate desires, in such circumstances, the house of mourning might well become a pretty bear garden. The hell's a bear garden? And the gathering of the clans, the prelude to a furious faction fight. In those rough times, we should find death, especially if it came unexpectedly, looked upon by one side of the family with ill-disguised suspicion. Thus, the ceremonious viewing of the body by friends and relations before the burial, a custom to which we still unthinkingly subscribe, was originally an obligation in order that those who were present at the death might clear themselves of any suspicion of complicity in foul play. Those who attended the funeral came quite as much with a view to satisfying themselves that murder had not been committed, and that the estate should be faithfully divided, as from any pious interest in the spiritual welfare of the deceased. There is yet another purpose for the funeral gathering which must not be overlooked. The funeral repast was at one time known as the Averil, at which a special form of crisp bread or cake and ale was provided. This was of the nature of the simnel cake or the soul bread, still used in Belgium at the funerals. The word Avril or Arvel means her ale, heir ale, or succession ale, from which we see that the feast was once considered not so much as a commemoration of the dead, but as a banquet to welcome the new heir to the title or property. The king is dead, long live the king, or in lesser measure, the squire is dead, let us welcome the young master who succeeds him. As we have seen in other instances, the Christian mind, in adopting the funeral repast, puts its own interpretation on the custom, and distributes food and drink freely on drinks freely on such occasions in the large spirit. Jesus Christ. As we have seen in other instances, the Christian mind, in adopting the funeral repast, puts its own interpretation on the custom, and distributes food and drink freely on such occasions in the larger spirit of hospitality, giving at the same time alms as well as provender to the poor and to those who were in need of support. Considerable sums of money were often left by will to be spent in this manner at death amongst relations and dependents, on the expressed or implied condition that the pious prayers of all who participated should be offered for the repose of the departed soul. Whilst the rich might well purchase prayers in this manner in exchange for a liberal hospitality, the poor were not behind in such measure of display as they could afford, but they might well experience difficulties in provisioning their larders to meet so large a call upon their humble resources. So we find that in many countries it has been a usage for the mourners invited to bring with them an offering of food to augment the feast. Now, this gift of the guest to the house of mourning, where it still exists, is generally in some form or symbol, as is also the gift of the house mourning to those attending the burial. The Averil, as a rule, was, to put it plainly, an unrestricted gorge, wherein the honor of the bereaved family was thought to depend much upon the quality and, above all, upon the quantity of the good things provided, both liquid and solid, which is very much the view held at the present time in the lower orders of society. It was sometimes the custom for the women to eat separately from the men, who were inclined at the promptings of the liquor to forget their grief and become amorous over their cups. Even the beast in the stable was not forgotten, which had contributed its labors in bringing the guests many weary miles to the feast, for it was against the canon of etiquette that the guest should carry with him the necessary fodder, the provision of which entailed another considerable expense on the host. In the days when traveling by road was inevitable, the stabling capacity in such an event would be taxed to the uttermost. Some interesting details as to the consumption of food on such an occasion is quoted by Capes from a record of 1309, when the provisions were as follows: 1.5 butts of cider, 5 pigs, 1 hare, 5 sheep, 13 hens, 19 geese, 1.5 gallons of oysters, 2 hogs, 9 capons, 1.5 carcasses of beef, 4 bacons, 4 bacons, is that 4 pigs? Besides wine, ale, eggs, bread given to the poor and friends, and a fee of 66 shillings and 8 pence to the chaplain. 50 pounds of wax was also used, presumably for candles. At the funeral of one Oliver Heywood of Thoresby, 17th century, the Averil consisted of cold posset, stewed prunes, cake, and cheese. An Averil in 1673, which was considered as rather shabby according to the notions of those times, provided nothing but a bit of cheese, a draught of wine, a piece of rosemary, and a pair of gloves. Amongst the poor, the mourners only expected to be provided with a special roll of bread baked for the occasion, whilst the cost of the liquors consumed, rum, ale, or a mixture of both, known as dog's nose, was defrayed by a fund collected on a plate placed for the purpose in the middle of the table, to which all present contributed. At the Averil of one Charnock, things were done fairly well. 80 people were bidden to the feast, which cost 4 shillings and 6 pence per head. The bill, we are told, was defrayed by a friend. Fights were frequent in these rough days, and we read that gorging, pausing, and biting were common methods of settling family disputes when the liquor had roused the mourners to a sense of injustice. Mrs. Gaskell, in her Life of Charlotte Bronte, in describing the Yorkshire villages at the period, tells us that the custom of Averils was as prevalent as ever, and that after the burial had taken place, the sexton, standing at the foot of the open grave, announced that the Averil would be held at the Black Bull, or some other local hostelry, where the mourners and friends repaired. Andrews, writing of Scotland in the last century, and this is the 19th century, tells us that there was a lamentable amount of ale and whiskey drinking before and after the funeral. The company began to assemble 2 hours before the time appointed for the corpse to be carried from the house. If the deceased was a farmer, each of the guests were offered a glass of whiskey at the gate of the farmyard, and another on crossing the threshold. On entering the guest room, a portion of shortbread and another glass of whiskey were handed to him. a reverential silence being observed for a time, after which conversation was carried on in whispers. When all the guests were assembled, the minister came, and a religious service was held, which lasted about 3/4 of an hour. This was followed by handing round cheese, oat cake, and whiskey, and afterwards shortbread and more whiskey. Then the coffin was carried out, followed by all those who were sufficiently sober to walk straight. Most of the accounts of state and official funerals met with in old records make much of the quality of the fare provided, in some such terms as and this the burial done to the place where there was a great dinner. Greet. Not great, but greet. We're having trouble with the page here. Prunes have been mentioned as an Averill dish. They are accepted for the purpose on account of their black skins, which give a note of mourning appropriate to the occasion. In Belgium, where we still find many survivals of the funeral orgy, the cakes are coated with a dark-colored chocolate icing and are served on black paper mats with fretted, cut-out edges, whilst custom dictates that only white wine shall be served in order to avoid the introduction of color. It has been stated that the Jewish religion discourages any form of funeral display, and in contrast to the lavish hospitality of the Averill, the guest of the Orthodox Jew is only offered such cold comfort as may be obtained from hard-boiled eggs and salt. I'll be honest, I'd rather have hard-boiled eggs than a prune. Apart from its sustaining properties, the egg, like our Easter egg, is used as a symbol of regeneration, whilst the salt, as a very ancient token of incorruptibility, has been very frequently used at Christian burials. An interesting survival is mentioned by Hollett, who states that in Cumberland the mourners are each presented with a piece of rich cake wrapped in white paper and sealed, a ceremony which takes place before the lifting of the corpse, when each visitor selects his packet and carries it home with him unopened, and in some parts of Yorkshire a paper bag of biscuits, together with a card bearing the name of the deceased, is sent to the friends. In this we clearly trace the custom alluded to of obtaining prayers in exchange for a material consideration, whilst the more substantial gift of a flagon of ale and a cake given to the officiating minister in the church porch. The priest's lodgings was frequently built over the porch in olden days, would be considered as partly in payment for services rendered, and probably also for the merit of his special prayers. In the Greek church, Macedonia, the papa, or priest, who conducts the funeral service receives a present of a dish of corn, cooked in a particular manner with sugar. This delicacy of corn symbolizing resurrection and sugar, the symbol of heavenly bliss, is made and presented to the priest by the women of the house of mourning on the 3rd, 8th, and 13th days after the death, and again on the 1st and 3rd anniversaries, in order that the departed soul should be remembered in his prayers. In Norway, the guests bring with them an iced cake, not an aged cake, on the sugary coating of which the initials of the deceased are inscribed. These cakes are carried in painted wooden baskets and presented to the widow or nearest relative, who sits in state at the entrance of the house to receive the offerings. In return, the guests are regaled with wine and coffee in token of welcome. A huge feast follows. The Chinese offer helps, both of food and clothing, etc., of substantial value, and the same practice is common amongst African tribes. We need go no farther than Ireland in order to see a wake which still retains the character of what was at one time common in this country. It is particularly reminiscent inasmuch as it has for its purpose the calling together of friends and relations to pray for the soul of the departed. The wake is as of old the meeting place where half forgotten family dissensions are apt to come to light. It is an opportunity for a lavish display of hospitality, often far above available means, in order that the honor of the family, however tarnished in other respects, may be publicly upheld. The wake appeals to the Irish peasant as an opportunity to indulge in a good time when whiskey, snuff, and tobacco will be pressed upon the guest in return for a prayer for the departed. In fact, for the time being, the house of mourning has all the advantages and more of the disadvantages of an inn. That drunken riots may take place in such circumstances, we may well believe. Though, as a popular jibe in fiction, perhaps something has been added to the Irish wake by way of picturesque embellishment. What do you got, bruv? Excesses, it might be mentioned, are strongly discountenanced by the Church, whose priests are forbidden to attend a wake where drinking is likely to take place. And as a further measure to restrict abuses, the body is ordered to be buried much sooner than is the case in this country. Whilst in England today, again, this is the 1920s, the formal funeral feast is frequently to be met with in country districts. It has become, generally speaking, an uncertain event, but there yet exists, even amongst the more enlightened people, an uneasy feeling that something of the kind is expected of them, and that wine and some sort of light refreshment should be provided on the day of the burial. Let it be said for their assurance that beyond the reasonable necessities of some hungry relation, the funeral feast is one of a series of degraded superstitions which follow in natural sequence after death, and that where it is retained, it is in ignorant fear of committing some milder form of sacrilege. Enough has perhaps been said for us to realize how our funeral repast, ranging from a matter of wine and biscuits to a good square meal, is only a survival of all kinds of pagan practices, which have no place whatever in modern life. Another bogey which we carry along with us, fearing to let it drop lest it should rise up again and mow at us, or that our revengeful dead will rise to haunt us for showing a want of respect to their memory. There are various customs connected with food and the dead, not necessarily in the sense of the feast. In the 17th century in Scotland, any milk, onions, or butter which happened to be in the house at the time of death were thrown away, as it was thought that in some manner the spirit would enter and corrupt them. In Brittany, butter was purposely placed on the table when a person had died from cancer, in the belief that the disease would enter the butter, which was afterwards taken outside and buried. In Brittany, milk might remain in a room with the dead, but water standing in a jug must be removed, lest the wandering spirit should be drowned in it. The opposite view was taken in other places when water was purposely left in the death chamber, in order that the spirit might wash and purify itself, and thus leave the milk alone, a very important matter at the farm. Water also played a part in the obsequies of the Greeks, who placed the supply in a jug on the grave of an unmarried man to show that he had not had the nuptial washing marriage ceremony, as also to indicate that he left no heir. In the funeral procession, the jug was carried by a youth. On the continent, we may sometimes find a cup-like receptacle on the grave in which holy water is now placed. This is a direct survival of that used on early graves for the purpose of food offerings being made. Let us conclude our consideration of the funeral feast with the story which comes to mind of a country funeral, where the undertaker's mutes were pressed into service to act as waiters during the inevitable repast. One of the guests, a local magistrate whose sense of duty had led him to join a rather mixed company, was startled during a pause in the dull conversation, which had been carried on in hushed tones round the table by the mournful voice of a mute, who whispered in his ear, "Excuse me, sir, the corpse's brother takes wine with you." The procession conducting the body to the grave has always offered a welcomed opportunity for the display of pomp, circumstance, and ostentatious grief, so prized by vulgar minds. The average man or woman can claim public attention only at marriage and burial, and on each of these occasions a non-entity becomes the center of attraction in a ceremonial procession to and from the church. The Roman citizen dearly loved to garnish the funeral cortege with all kinds of theatrical embellishments, and once again we can trace in the custom the old dread of the return of the avengeful spirit, should anything be left undone which might give honor to the susceptibility of the dead. Let's take a look at this before we move on. Illustrations from Grecian pottery. Note, method of constructing funeral pyre. 2. Note, wailing women, uncoffined body carried on bier. Or is it a bear? I still don't know. The retribution would follow as a natural consequence of neglect was the one certainly recognized by a people whose gods were so numerous and religion so involved that only their priests knew anything about either. Marshaled by the dismal trader of the period. What? Who was appropriately dressed in black. The body was conducted from the house on the third day after death. The corpse had been washed, anointed, and dressed in the ceremonial toga, and placed without pall or shroud on a bier, around which incense was burning. In the case of a citizen of rank, the servants of the household acted as bearers. And I'm going to stop there. Look at these slobs. Are they eating chicken? All they eating chicken, bruv. There's the early form of the modern S. Obviously, it's not modern to our day, but it was modern at 1926. All right, now let me block this idiot who asked if I was reading the Bible. Bye, bitch. Don't you ever ask me if I'm reading the Bible when I'm clearly not reading the Bible.